This is the Dive Into Discovery podcast, where curiosity meets insight, and every conversation uncovers a new layer of understanding.
All right, so get this picture in your head. You're a Viking sailor centuries before GPS, right? You're out on the open ocean, and the sun's your guide. But what happens when clouds roll in?
Well, that's where the legend of the Sunstone comes in.
Right, the Sunstone, this almost mythical navigation tool that Vikings supposedly used to find the sun, even on cloudy days.
And it might not be just a legend. There's some really interesting evidence that suggests Vikings might have actually used a special crystal to navigate.
So we're talking about Iceland spar, right?
Exactly. It's this type of calcite crystal, and it has this crazy property called birefringence.
Birefringence, that sounds kind of complicated.
It is, but it's actually pretty cool too. Think about polarized sunglasses. You know how they cut down on glare?
Yeah.
Well, that's polarization. And Iceland spar does something similar. It splits light into two rays. And Vikings might have used that to figure out where the sun was even on cloudy days.
Okay, but how does a crystal help find the sun? I'm not getting that part.
So birefringence means the crystal splits light into two rays. Right? Even on a cloudy day, sunlight still makes it to Earth, and some of that light is polarized. So Vikings could look through Iceland spar and rotate it, and they'd actually see a difference in brightness between those two rays.
I see.
And that difference could point them towards the sun's location.
You know, it's funny you mention this because the Norse sagas, those epic Viking tales, they actually talk about sunstones.
Oh, yeah.
Like in the saga of St. Olaf, there's this story about King Olaf using one to pinpoint the sun on a cloudy day. It's a pretty wild story.
Yeah, and there's another saga, the Raudulfssáttr, where King Olaf uses a sunstone to figure out where the sun is when it's cloudy.
It makes you wonder if there's some truth to those stories.
Right. It definitely adds to the intrigue.
But here's the thing. If Vikings were using these sunstones all the time, wouldn't we have found more of them by now?
That's a great question, and it's one that archaeologists are still trying to answer.
So we've got the legends, we've got the scientific possibility, but could Iceland spar really work as a navigation tool?
Well, to answer that, we need to look at the bigger picture. The Vikings were known for being incredible navigators. These guys were masters of sailing by latitude, basically following an east-west course.
Right.
And to do that accurately, you absolutely need to know the sun's position.
So are you saying that a sunstone could have been that crucial piece that let them maintain course on those super long voyages across the ocean?
Exactly. And get this, researchers have actually tested this theory out.
Really?
Yeah, and they found that Iceland spar can pinpoint the sun's location within a few degrees, even with cloud cover.
Wow, that's pretty accurate.
It is. And it might help explain how the Vikings managed those amazing journeys to Greenland and North America way before the magnetic compass arrived in Europe.
That's incredible to think about. But we also have to consider the other side of the story, right? Like some historians say those sunstone mentions in the sagas might just be symbolic or even added to the stories later on.
Yeah, that's definitely possible.
So maybe the Vikings used a combination of methods, like a basic solar compass knowledge of landmarks, ocean currents, and then maybe the sunstone on top of all that.
Right, they were incredibly skilled navigators, so they probably used every tool they could get their hands on.
Even if the sunstone wasn't their main tool, just the fact that it could have worked is pretty mind-blowing.
Oh yeah, it gives you a glimpse into how Vikings understood and used nature to their advantage.
It's amazing.
You know what's really incredible is to think that something as simple as a crystal could have played a part in Viking exploration.
I know, right?
Even if the sagas did embellish things a little, the science behind Iceland spar shows us that it was at least possible, which totally changes how we view what they knew about navigation.
This is already so cool, and we're just getting started.
Exactly. We've just scratched the surface of the Viking Sunstone mystery. There's so many unanswered questions about how it fits into their history.
I can't wait to dive deeper.
Well, coming up next, we'll explore those lingering mysteries and the debate among researchers about this fascinating piece of nautical lore.
So we were just talking about how those sagas, they might not be like totally accurate historical records, right?
Yeah, that's a really important point, and it's something that researchers debate a lot.
So like what if those sunstone mentions were misinterpreted or something?
Exactly. Some argue that even though the sagas are valuable sources, they were written down like hundreds of years after the events actually took place.
Right.
So it's totally possible that descriptions of sunstones were exaggerated or even added in later, maybe to make Viking seafaring seem more You know?
Romantic.
Yeah, exactly.
So we kind of have to be careful and consider that the Sunstone might be more of a storytelling element than a hard historical fact.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that the sagas often blend mythology and history together.
Right.
So the idea of this like magical stone that can reveal the sun's location, it's a super cool story, but we should approach it with a healthy dose of skepticism too.
Okay, but let's say for a second that the Vikings did use sunstones. How would they have actually used them? Like, it's not like they had instruction manuals back then.
Well, researchers have actually done some really fascinating experiments to try and figure out how a sunstone could have been used practically.
Oh, cool.
So remember birefringence, how Iceland spar splits light into two polarized rays?
Yeah, and by turning the crystal, you can see a difference in brightness between those rays.
Exactly. So researchers found that when you hold a piece of Iceland spar up to the sky and you rotate it, so the two images, they kind of like line up and then they separate again.
Okay.
And the point where they line up most clearly, that points towards the sun, even if you can't see it behind clouds.
So Vikings could have just held up a sunstone, turned it around, and looked for that brightest point to kind of get their bearings.
That's the idea. It's incredibly clever when you think about it.
Yeah, it is. But even with a sunstone, navigating across a vast ocean would have been unbelievably challenging, right?
Absolutely. The Vikings likely used a whole bunch of different methods together.
Like what else?
Well, things like celestial navigation knowledge of ocean currents and winds. They might have even watched birds to figure out their direction.
It's amazing to think about all that knowledge and skill those seafarers had.
Totally. It really shows how adaptable and resourceful they were figuring out navigation long before modern tools like the compass were even invented.
This makes me wonder, if Vikings were using sunstones, could they have shared that knowledge with other seafaring cultures they came into contact with?
That's a great question. We know that other cultures, like the Inuit in the Arctic, they also used crystals with similar properties for navigation.
Wow, so maybe sunstone use was a lot more common than we initially thought.
It's definitely possible. The Vikings, they traveled all over the place and interacted with so many different people.
Right.
So they could have easily shared their methods or even learned from others.
It's fascinating how connected the world already was, even back then.
Absolutely. The history of navigation really shows how creative humans have always been, always pushing the boundaries of exploration and trying to understand the world around them.
And it seems like the more we learn about this, the more questions pop up.
That's the beauty of history and science, right? There's always more to discover.
Exactly. Each new little clue we find can totally change how we view the past. So this brings up another question. If sunstones really were a crucial part of Viking navigation, could there be more evidence out there just waiting to be found?
There's a really good chance of that. There are still so many shipwrecks from the Viking era that haven't been explored yet.
Wow.
Just imagine all the treasures and knowledge that could be hidden under the waves.
It's like a giant underwater treasure hunt waiting to happen.
Exactly. And with all the new underwater technology being developed, who knows what secrets we'll uncover in the years to come.
This deep dive has been amazing, and I'm really curious to hear your final thoughts on this whole sunstone mystery.
You know, before we wrap up, I want to leave you with something to think about. If the Vikings did have this seemingly simple but really powerful tool, what other incredible feats of navigation might they have achieved?
It's a great question.
We may never have definitive proof one way or the other, but just the possibility alone, I think it should inspire us to keep learning and keep exploring.
Yeah, it really is amazing to think about what the Vikings could have done with a tool like that, sailing by a crystal, discovering new lands. It's pretty awe-inspiring.
It is. It really changes how we view what was possible back then. And I think it reminds us that we need to stay open-minded when we're exploring history and science.
Yeah.
We might never know for sure if Vikings used sunstones.
Right.
But just the fact that it's a possibility, that's enough to keep us curious, and it inspires new research.
So looking back at this whole period of history, what can we learn from all of this today?
That's a good question. I think the Sunstone story, it shows us that human ingenuity really has no limits.
Yeah.
It encourages us to think outside the box, to challenge what we think we know, and to really appreciate just how resourceful people were in the past.
It also makes you appreciate how far we've come with navigation technology, right?
Oh, absolutely. We take GPS for granted these days, but can you imagine navigating by the stars or even a crystal? It really gives you a whole new perspective.
This whole deep dive has been incredible. So much information, from those epic sagas to those scientific experiments. I'm definitely walking away with a sense of wonder and a desire to learn more.
And that's what it's all about, right? Sparking curiosity, encouraging people to explore, and inspiring a lifelong love of learning.
Absolutely. I think it's safe to say this deep dive has done all of that and more. So any last words of wisdom for our listeners as they continue their own journeys of discovery?
I would just say keep your eyes open to the wonders all around you. The world is full of mysteries, both in the past and in the present, and they're just waiting to be uncovered. So never stop asking questions, never stop exploring new ideas, and never stop searching for knowledge, because you never know what incredible discoveries you might make.
And hey, maybe you'll stumble across a sparkling crystal on your next trip to the beach. You never know what secrets it might hold. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and until next time, keep exploring.
What did you think of this week's episode? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to join us next time as we dive even deeper. And as always, stay curious, because you never know what discoveries are just around the corner.